sight. In the darkness is the light. Out of the shadows of my life. In the darkness is the light.
Welcome once again to the So Weird podcast. I'm Zach.
I'm Kathy.
I'm Emily.
And I'm Kat.
And tonight we have a very special episode. We are very pleased to be talking to Mr. Jon Weisman, who has worked on many episodes of So Weird, as well as several other television series, is also well known for his baseball website, Dodger Thoughts. And we are so pleased that you could be with us here tonight, Jon.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. I love that people still care about the show. And with a generation of, I now work at Showtime, and there's a generation of people I was pleased to see have heard of the show. It used to be like the younger people I worked with weren't in the sweet spot for the show because they were just a little too old for it and yet not ready to, it just didn't work. But like now I'm working with people who actually watched the show as kids, so it's cool.
That is cool.
But I feel old.
Well, do we want to take this list of questions we'll alternate like we did last time?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess I'll start. And I have the general starter question here. How did you become involved in writing for television? And more specifically, how did you come to So Weird later on?
Well, the first question is, I actually grew up in Los Angeles, but didn't grow up in a Hollywood family, and it never occurred to me to write for TV, even though I lived here. And weirdly, it wasn't until I was in graduate school in Washington, D.C., and I was getting a master's in English, but I took a screenwriting elective just for fun, and I got hooked on screenwriting there, and so it basically led to me moving back to Los Angeles and at age 25 and pursuing writing for TV then. And I would say probably about 3 or 4 years after that, I'd written a Buffy spec script that came out really well. I think it was probably my best spec. And long story short, Jon Cooksey saw it, and we met. And he was so great. And I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but the thing about Jon is you could pitch him an idea. A lot of these meetings that you would go to, you would pitch ideas for the show, and they would say yes or no, and then that would be the end of the conversation. If you didn't have the perfect idea, didn't matter how good a writer you were. Especially starting out your career like I was, you're out the door. But with Jon, he was like, well, that idea is not quite right, but let's see what we can work with from it. And he eventually gave me a script, and that led to ultimately five or six scripts over the first 2 years or So Weird. So it was really about one of the best experiences I had in TV.
I'm curious, what was the Buffy spec script about?
The Buffy spec script was about a strain of vampires that could be out in daylight.
Okay. So I know we have a couple of fans of that show that listen to us. So
yeah. So I think I'm really proud of that script, even though it never got produced. So I'm not going to be too humble about it, even though it never got produced. But it was cool because I think it really worked within the universe of Buffy. And this was written during the Spike Drusilla era of Buffy. And it had like a good psychological subplot because it was basically like Buffy now had to be on duty 24 hours a day. And you could see the strain, the toll it was taking on her. So I was really happy with how it came out. And Fee being kind of, a younger version in a way of Buffy, I think it sort of worked for Jon.
Sounds like it would have been a good episode.
That I could write to that sensibility. Yeah, I mean, it's a different world, but yeah, I think that was just sort of like it had the right tone, I think.
So for you, what was the best parts of writing for So Weird?
Well, that I got to do it. I think I really liked that the show wasn't a throwaway show. It wasn't just Monster of the Week. It was a show. Again, I think an audience in this era would kind of take it for granted, but in that era, in late 90s, it was a big deal to have a show for not just teenagers but young teenagers, be able to be so take things so seriously and have some sort of dark undertones to it, and the way that John and Allie sort of developed the characters over the course of time, it really allowed you to get into some really emotional issues. And so that I never felt like I was writing down to an audience. I never felt like I had to. They never wanted me to. I felt that even though my dream had been to write for primetime TV for grown-ups, I felt like this was a really good place for me to be at that time. So I felt lucky to be writing for that show.
I love that, because that's one of my favorite things about the show is that I watched it as a 6-year-old and I was a serious kid, and I love that it never talked down to me. So thank you. Yeah,
no, I mean, I think you could see that from early on. I think my first episode was Memory, which I think was third or fourth one to air. And the show hadn't even really gotten deep into its mythology yet. But even that show was sort of like, you could see like the interaction between the kids. It wasn't like a typical Disney Channel, set up joke. It was like, you could already see the impatience with each other and the wondering what's really going on here. And I thought, I thought we got off to a good start pretty quickly with that.
That would be a good segue into your next question here, Kat.
Yeah. So about that, at the time of writing Memory, now we know that there was a whole story arc planned around the aliens, but at the time of writing, how much of that story arc was planned?
Well, Jon would have known way more than I did. So, in other words, I think a lot more was planned than I knew about writing that episode. So for me, it was pretty straightforward. Right. He gave me some of the parameters for that story, and I sort of filled in within those parameters, without really having much of a big picture understanding of what was going to happen.
Do you remember what those parameters were?
Well, nothing that you wouldn't be able to see from the show itself. It was basically this mystery about. I think I might have come up with the setting, but it was basically it was some sort of story where there was a town. They were arriving at a town like post visitation or something. I forget exactly, but in other words, I think the idea that the show had to get from A to B plot wise was something that Jon had set up, but I think the mechanics of making that happen was I had the freedom to try to come up with.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, so Kat asked you what was the best part of writing for So Weird. So I was wondering if there were any things that were particularly challenging for you to write, any particular scenes in your episodes, or maybe a concept that you were writing about that required more extensive research.
I had a lot of trouble wrapping my head around the Fibonacci sequence and how that played into how that went beyond just being a math thing. Into something that the idea that it reoccurs in nature and it could have a significance beyond just being something on paper. It was hard for me to turn that into plot, basically. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. I think every script had its own challenges, I think. And, that's what's hard about it is trying to, and what's cool about it at the same time is trying to work through it all. I think, but for example, that was the one that really made me stumble. There were for the one with the cloning episode, it's not like I had a real handle on the sciences of cloning. I had a couple of friends who were master's or PhD students in biology, so I kind of leaned on them for some of the information I needed. And in fact, I asked them, what's a disease? What would be a disease that someone could have that might cause them to, whatever, to need something to happen to save them, or to. Anyway, I came up with Huntington's disease basically on their recommendation, on my friend's recommendation. but I don't think I struggled with the idea of how just to storyboard that. That's not the right word, but how to just plot that out. But with Fibonacci, I was just like, I mean, to this day, I don't think my brain works that way to really understand.
Your episode was the first time I've ever heard about anything related to the Fibonacci sequence and the spiral, the Nautilus shell.
Yeah, same with me.
I just wanted to say, I went to the bookstore and I saw Dan Brown's book Origin, and on the cover is the Nautilus shell, and it's about, I guess, the origins of humanity and what happens when we die, I believe. So I just thought it was really interesting that that just automatically made me remember your episode.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it worked. And, obviously, Jon was the one who would story edit my scripts. And he, whenever I was, he molded the show into what he and Allie wanted it to be. And he could get you through a tough spot. He could help you get through a tough spot. So I obviously didn't do this by any stretch on my own. Mm-hmm. But hopefully it came out all right.
It came out great. When I got to college in my math course, we did the Fibonacci sequence, and I got super excited because it made me think of strange geometry.
Yeah, that episode is pretty well regarded, so you did good.
Thanks.
Okay. So my first question, which you kind of already answered, was how was it working with Jon Cooksey and Allie Marie Matheson? My other question was, did you ever meet Henry Winkler?
No, what's funny, though, is that Henry's stepson was in that screenwriting class at Georgetown.
Oh.
Coincidentally. Jed Weitzman. I think he's an exec out here now. But no, I've never met Henry Winkler. He's supposed to be the nicest person in show business, so I'm sorry for not having met him. But I haven't. I mean, I don't think he had any. He certainly didn't have any involvement on my level after the pilot. I mean, I think he was I don't know what his role was on the show, but it wasn't like a day-to-day kind of role working with me. Maybe it would have been working with Jon and Allie.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, just stepping outside of So Weird, I'm a little curious. You've done a lot of work in animation, children's shows, cartoons, and things of that nature. And first off, I'm interested in what are the differences in writing for live action versus writing for animation. And being a kind of a big nerdy person, I'm curious about the work you did on the Starship Troopers cartoon and more recently on Young Justice, which is a show I love.
Yeah. Well, the fundamental enormous difference between writing for the two is that with animation, you really direct on the page. So your stage directions have to have every shot plotted out. Because you're literally giving instructions to the animators of how to conceive the scene. It's not that the show doesn't have a director, but in a live action show, a director can sort of figure that out and will figure that stuff out after the script is completed. But with animation, it's all, the voices are being recorded early on, then it's being sent out to be animated, so everything has to kind of be in place. And so that was a huge adjustment to try to realize how precise you have to be. You have to call out every camera angle in an animation script. In a live action show, they don't want you to do that at all. They want a minimum of stage directions, just enough to get you through so that they have the basic idea of what's going on. I'm not a director innately, so I tend to like the live action format more. I'm more interested in what the people are saying, or I guess on some level thinking, than what angle the camera is going to take. But it can be fun to kind of try to see if you can come up with an angle that then gets played out in the show and ends up being kind of cool in an animated show. And then, if you've read my resume, you'll notice that the executive producer on a lot of the animated shows I work for has the same last name as I do. That's my brother, Greg, and he's really a career, just a great leader in that field, having, done shows like Gargoyles.
Yeah.
Spectacular Spider-Man and a bunch of other stuff, and Young Justice being the one that's coming back now. And so, I mean, I love working with him. He wouldn't give me my first job. I had to get my first job on my own. So my first animation job was on, actually my second one was on Hercules, the Disney animated cartoon based on the movie.
Right.
I had a job before that. Disney was doing 101 Dalmatians as kind of a more Disney Junior style show. And I wrote something for that, but it didn't end up being produced. But technically, it was my first job. But my first produced animated script was on Hercules. And then I think I got to work with Greg on, I think I co-wrote a Men in Black half-hour script with him. And then Max Steel was the first show where I got to sort of write on my own with him as my boss. And he's so smart. And his show, I mean, the kind of thing I was talking about with Jon Cooksey. I mean, his shows are so thoughtful and so complex from a character standpoint that it's a pleasure to write for them. And I would have been happy to continue writing on Young Justice and fully intended to, but which I wrote for the first 2 seasons of Young Justice, and then Warner Brothers sort of out of nowhere invoked this no nepotism clause. So even though I had previously worked for Greg in a number of circumstances and had earned those jobs legitimately, because like I said, I had built my career up before I started working for him. They just wouldn't grandfather me at all. And it was really frustrating because I'd really love to be a part of the upcoming season of Young Justice. But
I was going to ask if you had any involvement with the new season. That's disappointing.
No,
that's weird that they would do that.
I literally did. I rewatched the first 2 seasons, which it's not a chore, but I rewatched all the episodes, and we did all the research. We had a new Bible was kind of being developed, and then literally the week before our first story meeting, I was told. Actually, it might have been the night before, but shortly before, I was told not to come. So it was a bummer.
That's really weird.
But so it goes. The show will be great even without my lowly presence.
And for the record, I love gargoyles as well. So
yeah, me too.
Yeah, I mean, Gargoyles is the one that really is sort of still, I think, preeminent for so many reasons.
Just today, they were talking about how supposedly Jordan Peele wants to make a live-action Gargoyles movie for Disney.
Okay,
so.
That's what I was wondering. I saw stuff on Twitter today about Jordan Peele and Gargoyles, and I couldn't find the article that it was linked to. Was it an article or was it a tweet?
So it was an article, and supposedly he pitched the idea to Disney, and Disney isn't sure if they want to do it, which is absurd to me. I mean, the guy just won an Oscar. Let him do whatever you want. You're Disney. You're the biggest film company in the world. But
yeah, I mean, yeah, that show is. I know, in some level, people are sick of revivals, but that show is overdue for coming back. I just hope Greg gets to be part of it.
Oh yes, I definitely agree with that. So that was off topic, though.
Yeah.
So getting back to So Weird, I've noticed
Getting back to So Weird.
like 3 out of 4 of the episodes that you were part of were more sci-fi based. So which do you personally prefer writing for? The sci-fi based phenomena or the more supernatural based episodes?
Well, I guess I didn't think of it in those terms. So I'm not sure if I have a preference. I think my point was, could I see where the character's journey was, what their character's journey was, and whatever milieu or world it was set in, I feel like I could work within that world, same as if it had been, if it were a cop show or a medical drama or something. I feel pretty comfortable going from one place to another. I mean, honestly, the episode that was in my wheelhouse was the softball game episode for obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. So I guess you would say that was more of a supernatural one, but that's not the reason why I had a comfort zone with that one. It was because I kind of knew what I was doing. I had a lot of ideas to bring to that one, but I mean, I kind of loved that with So Weird, you could do different types of episodes, basically, and not just mine, but just watching the others. Whether it was, for example, like I won't remember the title, but like the Bigfoot episode, or something that just took you out to a different place and sort of reimagined legends or whatever. I think that's what was one of the strengths of the show.
We interviewed Dave Squatch Ward, and one of the questions we asked him, I'll ask you now. I think it should become one of our traditions. Have you ever experienced anything paranormal? And if not, what's the weirdest thing that's ever happened to you?
I don't know if this counts. I can remember, well, I'm sure this doesn't count, but I'm going to say it anyway. But as one of my earliest memories at age 3 was spending a night at my grandparents' apartment and absolutely being convinced there was a ghost there. Absolutely being convinced, to the point where my parents had to come out at midnight and pick me up. Now that's a 3-year-old, so I don't know if that qualifies as like really having experienced something, but it's probably as close as I can get. I don't think I'm someone who, I mean, that hasn't been sort of my daily life kind of thing where I'm like kind of feeling like there's something else happening around me. So I don't know. I think that may be it. I don't deny that. I mean, weird stuff happens, but, and often I'll think the fates are against me or something, but I don't think that's really in the spirit of your question. I don't think that's it.
All right. My next question is, were any good relationships formed during the run of the show?
Well, I mean, I really valued the relationship with Jon. I was in Los Angeles and the show was shot in Vancouver. I went up there once. I saw my first episode being filmed, and I paid my way to do it just because it was such a thrill for me. And then the other relationship whenever I did that chat with you guys a couple of years back online, I think. Yeah. So, I mean, my first date with my wife was at the So Weird premiere party, so I guess that relationship counts as a good one being formed. So we're coming up on 20 years on that. Next January will be
congratulations.
I'm coming up 20th anniversary of our first date. So and at that, there should be some sort of So Weird anniversary celebration for that.
There should be.
There should be. I concur, and that's so sweet.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, honestly, I was pretty marooned down in Los Angeles. Jon had been in Los Angeles. Jon and Allie had been in LA, basically, I think, doing their careers. And when they got hired to do So Weird, they went up to Vancouver, and 20 odd years ago, and they never left. So yeah, I didn't have a tremendous amount of interaction. It was nice to meet the cast when I was up there. I met everyone except Mackenzie. But that was, and I saw them at the premiere party, and then that was literally it. That was the last time I saw anybody.
Okay, do we want to introduce some questions from our listeners here? Mm-hmm. Okay, this is from Emily, not Emily, a different Emily on YouTube, which is, what do you think became of the characters after the show ended?
I wish I had thought about that. I kind of, the thing about the show is I kind of dropped out of the show for during season 3 for reasons that may be apparent. My loyalty was pretty strong to the original group, and I don't mean that personally against the new people. I'm just saying, like, the show for me was really kind of the first 2 seasons, and sort of powerful stuff with Fia and her father that we reached at the end of that time. And so I don't know what happened. I definitely imagine that a scenario where I like to think she gets the answers she's looking for and moves into adulthood in some level of peace. I guess if you ask me that, if I think about that question, I don't think of Fia as someone who's 35 years old or whatever, and still searching for answers. Which is not to say she wouldn't have interest in paranormal things, but I like to think that she, through her determination and through her brilliance, frankly, gets to the place she needs to be at, mentally and emotionally. So if this answers your question, I have sort of an optimistic view of what happens to them at the end of the day. And then Molly, Mackenzie could be, maybe she's like Patti Smith or something. She's like out there at age, age 60 or 70, sort of giving command performances for people.
Sort of an elder pop statesman.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, but I feel good about those characters and where they go. I don't see a tragic situation for them.
Oh, good. So earlier I asked you a little bit about the writing for Memory. Now, can you tell us a little bit about the writing process behind Strange Geometry? Because that episode is really such a pivotal moment in the overarching arc of So Weird. Were you given the idea of that big Rick reveal about him being into the paranormal? How much input did you have into that big dramatic ending?
Yeah, that would have come from Jon. Again, that's that's kind of a thing where you need to get to that point, I think. I think that may have been the hardest episode for me to write, because it was hard to just sort of hammer out how we were going to get there. Is that the episode where we introduced Papa Bear?
Yes.
Okay. So that was stuff like that. Stuff like that comes pretty well to me. Like the sort of interpersonal stuff, the stuff that builds to where you go. I mean, we got there. We got there, but that's part where I think I had to really do a lot of revising to try to hit that stuff up, hit it in the right way, and to make it, because you had to make it believable, and you had to make it fantastic, not in the greatness sense, but in the sort of supernatural sense. And I had trouble. Among the things I had trouble with during the writing of the script was sort of visualizing. Even after we came up with kind of what the solution was to get to the end, I had trouble visualizing how they were going to pull this off from like a set design standpoint. I think they did a great job. I don't know. I haven't watched the episode recently. I hope it still holds up today, but I remember thinking at the time they did a great job with the visuals of that. But in writing, I was like, are we pulling this off? Because if it did look bad, I think that would have deflated the drama of it all. But yeah, that was a hard process. I was glad to get through it, and I was pleased with how it came out. But I'm no magician, so that was a hard script to write.
Well, you did a phenomenal job with it. It's one of the episodes that I've always remembered. When it first came out, it gave me nightmares with that newsreel scene. And
yeah,
still just holds up so well.
Yeah, they did a good job. That's the thing. They made difficult things work visually on that show, that considering the budget that they must have had to work with, I think it's pretty impressive. And in the era they were working in too.
A few minutes ago, you mentioned the season 3 that aired. So I was wondering, as fans, we know that the season 3 that aired wasn't the one that was planned. Did you pitch any ideas for the original season 3?
Okay, so my recollection of what happened is basically one day I woke up, figuratively speaking, to the news that Jon and Allie weren't going to be on the show anymore. And that was before we got to the point of talking about which episodes I would be doing. So no, I didn't pitch any ideas for them.
Okay.
I then met with the new producers, got the lowdown on Alex I guess. And I had a very friendly, nice meeting with them. Again, none of this is personal. None of this is personal. It was just I pitched some ideas. They weren't flying. The response I got was more discouraging than I would get for Jon. And you have to I have to explain to you something about my personality, which is I don't, or at least in that time, I tended to think the grass was greener at other places. And so I mistakenly, I would say, kind of withdrew from So Weird, and basically tried to hook up with another show. I remember there's a show called The Jersey on Disney Channel that I had a couple of meetings with, and I felt pretty confident at the time that I could get a script or two with them. And that didn't pan out, and then I found myself sort of out of work from either show. So it wasn't a very smart move on my part. It wasn't the first time I did something like that, and it wasn't the last time I did something like that. But I wasn't connecting with the show, with the new show in season 3 the way I had with the first 2 years.
You weren't the only one.
Well, maybe not. I mean, I definitely take responsibility for it. You know, I will say, once Jon and Allie were gone, it kind of let the air out of the balloon a little bit for me. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't step up and make it work with whoever becomes in charge, especially because it wasn't like they were tyrants or anything. I don't know if they were right or wrong in what they did. Like I said, I never really ended up watching season 3. But I know there was the directive to make the show lighter. And that was sort of, to me, unnecessary and kind of antithetical to what defined the show. But again, it wasn't like, I don't know if that there was no solution to that problem, or at least as far as my role on the show. So it's just kind of a combination of things, but yeah, it just didn't happen. Just couldn't connect on stories for them.
I understand. I think we all do.
Yeah, you're parroting a lot of thoughts we've mentioned on this show. So our next group of questions here is from a listener on YouTube by the name of Gino. And you sort of answered the first one, which was the episode Singularity involves the game of baseball. And was this a reference to your work for the Dodgers?
Well, it predates that.
Yeah.
By a lot. But obviously I had the lifelong interest in sports and baseball. And Jon specifically, he knew he wanted to do a sports episode. And so he threw that to me and said, what can you do? And I came up with, I think it was his idea. I'm pretty sure it was his idea to have all the different balls, all the different types of balls. I think he had this, I could be remembering this wrong. I think he had this idea early on of this visual of all those balls kind of crashing down. But again, how do you get there? And that scene, for example, the opening scene of the episode, which takes place at unfortunately it was raining while they were filming it, but it takes place in a softball game, and there's this play. If I don't know if you remember it, because it was the early opening scene of the show, but it was there's a play where the runner on third and the guy, and I think Jack holding the ball at first base, both realize they're both standing geometrically the same distance from home plate, and they both realize they have to race toward home plate at the same time, and they meet there at the exact same moment. That play I ripped directly off a play I saw while I was covering a high school playoff game in Palo Alto. That exact thing, that literally is how that game ended, a playoff game. The same thing. And I wrote that up, and Jon thought it was brilliant, relatively speaking. And I was like, and I took all the credit for it, even though, and then later I told him, well, I didn't exactly make it up. But yeah, loved writing that episode, and I felt I had a real feel for Mad Max in that episode, and the way it would be for a family where like you're the kid who's not into sports at all, but you're forced to be caught up in that world temporarily. And I liked most of all, I liked the emotional through line of that episode. Part of the reason I like sports, and particularly baseball, so much is because I think the actual real life sport gives you that kind of emotional story. I mean, baseball to me is just like a never ending movie with all these different characters coming in and out. It's just cast changes year after year, but it's baseball is very cinematic to me. And so I always was eager to sort of see if I could apply that to any creative writing I did.
Well, and Gina would also like to know, do you enjoy sports writing or television writing more?
Well, I like sports writing a lot because of what I just said, and because it's easier for me to be employed doing it. I think my dream career still would have been in TV writing. But to use a sports analogy, I was like a fringe player who couldn't break through and like sort of stay in the major leagues. I really just like, for whatever reason, I couldn't. I would interview for and pitch for primetime shows, and I couldn't break through. And I finally, I got dropped by my agent in, I think the end of 2000, and spend another year trying to get a new agent, and finally just took a break from that search and never really went back to it. Writing and entertainment has so much rejection involved. I mean, obviously there are some people who manage to bypass that completely, and more power to them. But for someone at my level, it was, God, it was great when things were happening. But when you go through these stretches where it wasn't happening, it was really hard on me. And really affected my self-confidence. I was unemployed when I got married. It's not necessarily, I was fine except you start to think, well, should you really be unemployed now? So it's just, I'd love to, and like I said before, I would have loved to have been writing for Young Justice, but I haven't been actively in the game of TV writing for several years now, really. And I kind of think now at my age, it's a little hard for me to consider trying to go back. I mean, you never say never, but I think my path, I've written 2 books now, 2 nonfiction books, and my path, if I ever were to try to pursue that, would be to try to write something that then could be adapted either by myself or someone else. But get a book published and then get it adapted, because I don't think anyone's going to be looking right now for a 50-year-old writer with my credits to, start staffing on their show or something. And I don't mean that to sound depressed. I hope that didn't come across as depressed. I'm very good with where my life has gone in the past 20 years since that So Weird party. But yeah, I love writing for TV and would still do it at the drop of a hat if it were feasible.
Well, and that leads into Gino's last question, which is, if a So Weird reboot ever came to fruition, would you be interested in working on that?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. For sure. I'd love to. I'd love to see it happen. I mean, I don't know. So let me ask you guys this. If you fantasize about something like that, is that with like Fee as the mother, or is that like you're getting a new 13-year-old Fee and starting and telling the stories again from her perspective?
Well, when we've talked about it, it's usually been like So Weird, the next generation. So I think that's sort of the idea would prefer to see in the discussions we've had about that.
Yeah, I definitely love all the original casts. So I definitely want, not really new characters, or maybe a few, but to see Fee and to see, Molly again, that would be great.
The big thing for me is seeing Fee finish her journey.
Yeah, but that's the thing. So if you want to see that, you sort of got to go back and do you think either you got to go back to have a new actress playing her at 13, or you got to say, oh, her journey's been going on for 20 years, which is interesting, but pretty intimidating. I mean,
well,
my God.
Maybe they could do an animated series.
Yeah,
and they could use Kara for the voice.
That would be awesome.
Well, and then the funny thing, of course, is that, I don't think this is actually happening, but, they talked about this Mad About You revival.
Right.
Which has you wondering what Kara's character, what would Kara end up having a role in that show somehow, which would have been really cool.
Well, the episode she was on, I believe the adult version of her character was played by Jeanine Garofalo, if I remember correctly. So.
Oh, was it?
I believe so, yeah.
Interesting. Well, still possibilities there.
You never know.
Yeah.
Right. So do you have any funny stories about what went on behind the scenes in the writing process of So Weird?
Well, yeah. If me sitting, banging my head against the wall, trying to figure out how to solve that problem in my bachelor apartment is funny, that's probably the most. I do remember I had this joke in the baseball script that was a Mark McGuire, Sammy Sosa joke, because at the time of the script, they were breaking all these pursuing all the home run records, and I had this joke about them, and Jon cut it. I was like, how could you cut that joke? It was so good. And he's like, it's going to be dated by the time X amount of months or years go by. I'm like, no, this joke is timeless. This is the perfect joke. This joke will last longer than this show will. It's the joke for all eternity. And he was right, by the way. The joke would have been dead in within 18 months probably. So it makes me laugh thinking about that. I mean, honestly, I think I was there's some sort of inside jokes. I name characters after friends, for example, and I mean, little stuff that no one else would care about. I think I really was happy with Papa Bear for some reason. I can't really explain why I loved that so much. Partly, actually, Jon loved it too, so maybe that part of the reason I loved it is because Jon loved it, and it was always cool to get his approval on something. But I just, everything from the moment I came up with their exchange where she goes, hey, he goes, me Cubs, and she goes, hey, Papa Bear, and the way that played out into something that just really spoke to their relationship just through those two tiny lines of dialogue. I mean, again, this is pretty far afield from what your question was, but I really get a kick out of remembering that.
That's really cool to know that you were behind Papa Bear.
Yeah. I mean, I can't take credit for much in the way of creating characters per se on that show, but I feel good about my contribution there. I mean, I guess I helped launch Kevin Zeger's career. Indirectly. Yeah.
Okay, well, this next question is from another listener of ours, Corey, and it's very simple. What's your favorite episode of So Weird and why?
Well, the Singularity has a special feeling for me, but I don't know if that would be, it's not a pivotal episode in the show per se. So maybe it's Strange Geometry, just because that was a big deal. I mean, I'm only picking my episodes too. There are better episodes out there that I could pick, but I'm not going to pick theirs. So sorry to my colleagues, many of whom have gone on to fantastic careers after So Weird. I'm not picking the best episode. I'm just picking what my favorite was. I'll go with Strange Geometry. Oh, and then Les Vegetables. That's another moment that I really like.
Oh yeah.
So for what that's worth. But yeah, I'll say Strange Geometry.
And Corey would also like to know, at the time when you were working on So Weird, did you ever think 20 years later it would still have a fan base that we would still be talking about the show all this time later?
well, it never occurred to me at the time. Again, so you're giving me credit for thinking about a lot of things. Like it wasn't a yes or a no. It's just like I just wasn't thinking that far ahead about a lot of stuff. Also, this was a world where, the internet was brand new at this time. I probably got my introduced to AOL in like 1993, I think, or it's 94.
Did you get one of the little discs in the mail?
Of course. Well, those were everywhere. I don't know how. Those were literally everywhere. Like you'd see them at supermarkets. There'd be stacks of them. And I had a dial-up connection. And but I wrote. Did you guys ever do the So Weird Online stuff?
Unfortunately, no, I didn't. I'm so sad I missed out on that.
I have a little bit of memories of it. That's a long time ago now, but I vaguely remember visiting the website.
So I did, but only in season 3, and I hated it.
So I don't know about season 3, but for seasons 1 and 2, I wrote the online stuff.
Cool.
And but it was like you have to. I couldn't even see what I was writing. Like I would write these little scripts. They'd be, I don't know, I think they were like 5 pages or 6 pages per. You would call it a webisode, but they would get computer animated online in very simplistic ways. And I had a dial-up connection to AOL. I couldn't load the final product onto my computer, so I never really saw it. But it was just this. It was basically this So-V character.
Yes, I've seen like screen captures of it online. That all got down when they redid the website for season 3.
Yeah, it's all gone. It's just, I'm sure it's gone forever. But it was like sort of like the story in the world that Fee was investigating. It was just the reason for these things was to they were sort of stealth teasers to watch new episodes. So they were always like creating some mystery about what was happening behind the scenes and then leaving a little bit of a cliffhanger at the end. And just getting back to this whole idea of like what would be happening, the internet has opened up so much of this sort of fan stuff that, and made it into such a community experience. I was just an enormous TV fan dating back to childhood, but the way I worshipped shows was basically, I'd record them on my VCR and rewatch them. And it was a completely solitary experience, or I might call my brother and talk about them. But there was no community, not even in there were chat rooms, I guess, but it wasn't like a chat room was sort of some sort of like global phenomenon that it enabled something like that. It was just like literally you might even be with, maybe there'd be like 10 people who had your same interest or something. So I had no idea what the internet was going to be even then at that point. I don't think. There was no Google. There was no, I don't think, no Yahoo, I think GeoCities was the popular way to have your own personal website, which is, people rightfully mock that today.
The late lamented GeoCities.
Yeah. So, or Alta Vista? I'm trying to think of these. These are all blurs from the past, but I can't even describe to someone who is, I guess, under the age of 30 or 25 for sure, what it was like 20 years ago. It's such a, for all the faults that we have in our social media today, it's just such a richer era for community today. So no, I had no idea. I'm glad the show, especially because it's amazing because the show doesn't seem to be available anywhere. So it's amazing to me that anyone still talks about it, even whether they thought it was great or not.
Well, the next question Corey has is, do you have a favorite song from So Weird?
I'm blanking on everything but In the Darkness right now.
That one's a great one too.
Well, that's like the definitive one, right? Can you give me some choices?
The River, Love is Broken, Rebecca.
Yeah, The Rock. These are ones we like.
Maybe a Rebecca, but I'll go with In the Darkness. That's the show. You know, it's not a clever pick, but it's like, to me, it's definitive.
And then lastly, Corey would like to know, what is your favorite project out of everything you've worked on?
I think So Weird.
Well, I was going to say, don't feel pressure to pick So Weird, just because that's the topic of this podcast.
I wanted to give it thought just to make sure. I didn't want to do a throwaway answer, but honestly, yeah, I think it was this.
Cool.
Very cool.
Jessica Williams. I met Jessica Williams
Yes.
while working at Showtime, and again, this goes back to your earlier thing about people still loving the show. It's like. She was a big So Weird fan, and so just to be able to like find someone who in person who was that excited to meet me only because I wrote, like, she was excited to meet me. I mean, I don't know if she was really excited to meet me, but she was like genuinely enthusiastic to talk about So Weird. Like that's cool that a show for young kids could still have that kind of pull today. Especially when it's kind of been relegated to obscurity. I think it's cool.
Okay. And this is from Facebook, from Lauren. She asks, if you haven't already answered this, she said, can you recall your creative process of writing these scripts you did for So Weird?
Well, you have to go through stages of writing a premise, or outlining the show, and then writing the script. Different producers like different levels of detail probably in their outline. I feel like Jon wanted a pretty detailed outline, although I'm having trouble remembering that part. But basically, when I got to the script stage, I did what I called a sandpaper draft, which was rougher than a rough draft, where I would really just write. I would convert the outline into script form and not give it any thought about whether any of it was any good, any dialogue. I would blow through it in completely uncensored, as far as like deliberating over a line or deliberating over direction. I would just go through it methodically, just getting it into a script form. And then basically I would just keep making passes at it and after the sandpaper draft, I would just start revising from page 1 on and go through it as many times as I needed until I was ready to send it off. And then I think once I hit a home run where Jon said this was close enough to where he could take it from there. But usually you'd get notes, and you do another set of revisions after you got Jon's notes. But yeah, that works for me because it's just basically it's a cliche, but you're chipping away at a sculpture until you get to where you're getting rid of all the stuff you don't need, and until you get to where it needs to be. And you struggle at certain parts, and one page might take you half the entire script time or something to finish. But that's just sort of how it goes. It's a process that it became a pretty regular process for me.
And would it be difficult to write the scripts for, a 24-minute show?
Difficult as opposed to, because of the length?
Yeah, the lengthwise. Like if you had more ideas or where things cut a lot.
Usually you find yourself at the end of the day struggling to fit in to the length, to fit it in, basically. You might be short on your first draft, but by the end you're usually long and trimming, and in those days at least, maybe playing with the margins to try to make things work, to make things look like they're the right length. But yeah, you get there. It's nice to have. I don't know how people do it today in the streaming age when they don't necessarily have time limits on their shows, but it's there are times where you'd really be frustrated by having to cut, but usually it's to your benefit.
That kind of ties into another question from Andrea. She was asking, were there any scripts you wrote for So Weird that you were proud of, or any scenes that ended up being cut or edited for time?
I can't remember what was cut, which is a lesson. You won't remember usually. So it's probably good enough to go. It's probably bad enough to go. I remember all the scripts fondly for different reasons. I don't, for example, think Memory was by any stretch the best one I wrote, but I still have good feelings about it. And like I said, I really struggled with parts of Second Generation, but I still have great feelings about that show. But all of them, I really do. I mean, I don't think I would have, with that show, there was never a case where I had to turn in something feeling bad about it.
Okay.
All right, and a more general question. Which was your favorite character on the show and why?
Well, Fee, for, I think, obvious reasons, not to shortcut it. Just a great character. And again, I think in this era, probably maybe more taken for granted, but I think even in this era, though, let alone back in the 90s, it was still, I think you guys would know this for sure, obviously, but, to have a female protagonist like that in that world, I think was still semi-groundbreaking. Buffy was brand new at that time, and Buffy is definitively groundbreaking. So I wouldn't say that Fee was derivative of her, but so I'd give Fee credit for standing on her own, but she was, a really dynamic, great character, I think. And so my point with Buffy being Fee might not have been the first one to come along in that era, but she was still sort of an exciting thing to have in a girl.
Okay, and then our last listener question. Well, actually, this is from Melissa, one of our occasional co-hosts. What advice would you give to aspiring writers?
Okay, so obviously the obvious one that you don't need me to tell you is to be writing and to be writing a lot. And for people who want to get in the TV business, absolutely, you got to be prepared for the rejection that may well face you. I think the piece of pragmatic advice that I can give you that is also pretty fundamental, but maybe not quite as obvious, is first of all, network like there's no tomorrow, and don't focus on networking with the executive producers of the world or the network CEOs of the world. Network with people that you're comfortable with. Network with people your own age. Network with people who have entry-level jobs. Just get to know people, because they want to do things too, and it's great to have people who have the same goals in mind. And then whether you work with them in that moment or a year from now or 10 years from now, as you guys move up in this industry, they'll know, if they know you, that is an immeasurable advantage to have. So I can't even imagine today. It was hard enough when I was trying to get my career going, but there's so many people trying to write. To be able to be more than just a name on a page is invaluable. The other thing I would say is, I was pretty much a writer straight through. I didn't have any other skills to offer, and I didn't develop any other skills. But, in the YouTube era, if you can even write create your own 2-minute video, your short something, do something that puts your, again, goes beyond just like what a spec script would be, to make your presence known. Start your own web series, do something, take control of your career as much as you can. Don't sit by the phone waiting for something to happen. Your agent is mainly there to negotiate deals that you've pretty much found for yourself. Certainly at the entry level, agents are not in the business of starting careers. Agents are in the business of taking careers and I was going to say exploiting them, but maximizing their potential. But they are not in the business of getting you off the ground floor. And one of my biggest mistakes was thinking that when I got my first agent, I had two, ultimately, that I'd solved my problems, and now they would find me work. They did get me the interview with So Weird. That happened, but for the most part, it's really up to you to make your career happen. So use every means you can. If you're in your 20s and you don't have kids, you're not married, whatever, I tell you, that time that you have to yourself, you'll never have it again. So when you have kids, you use all that time. That's the big advantage you'll have at that age.
Okay.
Since you write for the LA Dodgers and I'm a Mets fan, I have to ask you this question. How was your reaction to Chase Utley's slide that broke Ruben Tejada's leg?
I thought it was valid. It was not intentional, but the way the game was played at that time, it was legitimate. I'm happy that they've made the rule to ban those slides. I think you saw, I recall when I was writing for the Dodgers at that time, I think it was Daniel Murphy had done a very similar slide not long before. And, no one really said boo about that. But if that's what it took, I'm really sorry. Was it Rivera whose leg was broken?
Ruben Tejada.
Tejada, sorry. It was terrible that happened, unequivocally. But I think that was the game at that time, and so it's fine that it's changed since then. But yeah, that was quite a moment.
Yeah, I was at the game at Citi Field right after it happened. It was crazy.
Yeah,
and it was glorious.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is my last question, our last question of the Q&A. Is there anything you want to say to all the So Weird fans now that are going to be listening?
I'm just glad you're there, honestly. I don't know if this show means as much to the other writers as it did to me because, a lot of the other writers went on, like I said, to do big things. But this show meant a lot to me, and I was really proud to be part of it. I was genuinely proud to be part of it. So I'm just glad you're out there, and I do hope that, if nothing else, the show can be seen again, and outside of random YouTube searches.
Yeah, that's a big. Every episode of this podcast we talk about bugging Disney to get So Weird a digital release or an archive release or some sort of recognition from that enormous corporation that has much better things to do.
Yeah, and it's not too different from what my brother's been trying to do with Gargoyles. I think they're both two shows, different in many ways, but similar in a few that have sort of somehow missed this revival wave that has swept, I think, up lesser properties.
Yeah, though Gargoyles at least is available on DVD. They released. It was a weird thing where they released the first part of the second season, and then there was several years before they released the second half as a DVD on demand title. But but even So Weird doesn't even have that. There's not even an official release of this show at all.
Yeah. So let's hope. Hopefully, you guys can get enough momentum to make it happen.
Oh boy!
I think you guys are ground zero. It sounds like.
Well, is that everything we want to say to Jon?
I just want to say thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us before, also in the chat. I do love the episodes that you wrote. My favorite episode of So Weird is Strange Geometry. Even though a lot of people like Rebecca more, but I like Strange Geometry more.
That's fine. I accept the different. I'm happy anyone likes anything I've done. Honestly, I'm happy when I'm done writing it, but then I don't expect anyone actually to like. It's still a whole nother step to have people respond to it. So that does my ego good. My ego likes being done good too. So I'm glad of that.
Well, just looking at the list of episodes you did for the show, I'm not being flattering here. I legitimately enjoy every episode of So Weird you wrote to varying degrees.
That's fair. That's fair.
And I think we all enjoy Strange Geometry a lot. I think that's a favorite of all of ours.
Yeah, I think again, give credit to Jon Cooksey. That episode doesn't become what it became without him. I just, I did what I did to make it happen, but the vision for it is really, up above my pay grade. All
right. Well, I guess we'll just say, thank you once again so much for coming on the podcast and talking to us. We really appreciate it a lot.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. This was fun.
All right. Well, in that case, I guess that brings another episode of the So Weird podcast to its conclusion. Thank you so much for listening, and keep the faith.
And keep bugging Disney.
Yes.